Welcome to our colloquium. I'm not sure of whether there's something next Thursday for the undergrads, but there may be. So take a look at your Monday emails. But today we have a visitor in the department whom I'm very pleased to introduce to everyone. Professor Benjamin Bruening started his academic career here in our College of Humanities, where he was a double major in linguistics, of course, but also in Middle East studies, Arabic. After finishing here, he went on to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he studied with David Pazetsky and Ken Hale, a luminary in the Native American languages here in North America. His dissertation was Syntax at the Edge, Cross-Clausal Phenomena, and the Syntax of Passamaquoddy, which is one of the Algonquian languages. Professor Bruening has published enormous numbers of papers. So he has 35 publications in the major journals in the area, including Linguistic Inquiry, many times, Glossa, many times, Natural Language and Linguistic Theory, many times, Syntax, the Journal of Linguistics, and given his wide range of interest also in the Journal of East Asian Languages on some Vietnamese work. His 2018 paper on the lexicalist hypothesis, both wrong and superfluous, in the LSA's journal Language, was the winner of the best paper in the journal for that year. He has tons, I gave off after a huge number counting, of invited presentations and refereed presentations at all the major conferences. He had a significant significant grant from the NSF, a 3-year grant, in which he developed materials for getting at scopal ambiguities and quantifiers in a natural setting, and then use them to gather the appropriate data for subsequent publications that I didn't read the titles of. And has brought that kind of attention to field work, as we were just discussing in the syntax group, to further field work. Right, Brandon, you were seeing that. So please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Professor Benjamin Bruening.
Thank you. Thank you for that really nice introduction, and for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, I was a linguistics major in this very building. I don't think I've ever been in this room though, so this is the first time here. So what I'm going to talk about today is a mysterious prefix in Algonquian languages. So this is a prefix that occurs in all of the Algonquian languages. It indexes a person, one of the arguments of a verb. And since it exists in all of the languages, it's reconstructed to Proto-Algonquian, where it's reconstructed as ne, ge, and we, which are first person, second person, and third person. So here's an example from one of the Algonquian languages, Passamaquoddy Malisi. So it's this little prefix K that indexes a second person. Here it's the subject. Okay, now this prefix is unusual in several respects. So one way it's unusual is in its position. All of the other inflection on the verb is suffixes. So you can see a whole bunch of suffixes over here. This is the only prefix. So it's unusual in that respect, but that's not that unusual. Many languages are like that. It's even more unusual in where it goes. So here it goes on the verb stem, but if there's what's called a preverb, which is something like this thing meaning try, then the prefix goes on the left of that instead. And that thing can be separated from the verb stem by other things, here by a second position clitic. Okay, so this is not actually going on the verb stem where all the suffixes go, it's going on somewhere over to the left. And if there's more than one preverb, it goes on the leftmost preverb. And these preverbs, again, can be separated from the verb stem. Okay, so this is kind of strange. So this is what I want to try to account for, is why this prefix is going where it goes. So I'm going to propose that it's in a class of things that I will call head adjuncts, and I'll explain what that means. And these have the interesting property that they always attach to the linearly first element of the appropriate type in the clause that they occur in, or the phrase that they occur in. And I'll give you an example from English. There actually is one in English too that I claim is the same thing. And I'll try to explain why they appear where they do. Okay, so let me just give you some background first on Algonquian languages. So this is a very large family of languages, and that map's not showing up very well there. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, from this angle, it doesn't look good. Okay, so these are the Algonquian languages. I just stole this map from Wikipedia, and it's somebody's attempt to recreate the distribution of the languages at the time of European contact. So this is not current day, but a few hundred years ago. So you can see the Algonquian languages are all over. They go from the eastern seaboard all the way over to Montana, and I forget what province that is. Saskatchewan? No, I forget. Okay, so there's Blackfoot way over here in the west, and on the east, there's a Mi'kmaq here in Nova Scotia. And then the English settlers first encountered most of the Algonquian languages along the eastern seaboard. So a few famous ones with Carolina Algonquian, which what's the guy's name? Smith encountered down there. And then in Massachusetts, there was Abenaki, Wampanoag, and a bunch of other languages. So these languages are all extinct up to that little gap right there. Only Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Mi'kmaq are still spoken. And these other languages, I think, are mostly still spoken. I'm not so sure about Shawnee and Miami, Illinois, at this point. But their distribution has changed a little bit too. But so this language family is very large. It goes all over North America, consists of lots of different languages. Now, as far as relations go, there's only one subgrouping, which is the Eastern languages. They form a subgroup, they share things in common. The other languages are all thought to just be daughters of Proto-Algonquian. So there's each individual language is a daughter of Proto-Algonquian, and then there's Eastern Algonquian, which is another daughter, which then branches into all of these languages. Now, all Algonquian languages have this prefix, as I mentioned. So here's just a few examples. So here's Western Abenaki. So now I'm using the first person one, which always has an N. So Western Abenaki has this prefix. Ojibwe has it. Here's an example from Blackfoot, has the same prefix, and Potawatomi has the same prefix. Okay, so it's a pan-Algonquian phenomenon. And it also appears on nouns, indexing the possessor. So here's an example of my mittens. It has this prefix, muchesuk, to mean my mittens. And I forgot to mention that a lot of the examples that I use come from texts, which were published by the Abenaki Bilingual Education Program, and they have these great illustrations. So I'm giving you some of the illustrations that accompany the examples throughout. So I didn't mention the turtle one back here. So this goes with "They Will Try to Kill You." It's a story about a guy who all these other people are jealous of, and they're going to kill him. So this magical being, Gluskot, turns him into a turtle, and that protects him. He doesn't get killed. Okay, so back to Algonquian languages. So I won't be talking about nouns. I'm going to focus on verbs, but the facts are basically the same as far as I know. It's just harder to see what's going on with nouns. And I'm going to illustrate with Passamaquoddy Maliseet. It's also sometimes called Maliseet Passamaquoddy. But as far as I know, all the facts are the same in every other language too. The prefix behaves the same in all the languages. So this is a member of the Eastern branch. It's spoken in Maine and New Brunswick, Canada. So the Passamaquoddy are in Maine, the Maliseet are in New Brunswick, and the languages are mutually intelligible. They differ somewhat, but they are basically the same language. So here are some references if you're interested. And again, I'm taking the examples from these great texts with really good illustrations. Here's a picture of younger me with a couple of Passamaquoddy elders that I worked with back around the year 2000 or so, maybe. Here's where Passamaquoddy Maliseet is spoken. So this is Maine. Here's the province of New Brunswick in Canada, and Nova Scotia is over here. Passamaquoddy is spoken in two communities, one right down here, and the other one slightly further inland. One's called Zibayi, and the other one is Medokmiku. And then Maliseet is spoken in, I think, 5 communities in New Brunswick. Okay, so let me go back to the person prefix. Okay, so Algonquian verbs are divided into 3 different conjugations. They're called orders for some reason, I don't know why. the independent order, the conjunct order, and the imperative order. The independent order is used in most main clauses and a few embedded clauses as well. The conjunct order is used in various different kinds of embedded clauses and most WH questions. And then imperatives are used in imperatives where you'd think they'd be used. And the distribution of this prefix is that it appears only in the independent order. So there's a reflex of the third person prefix in this independent order with the same verb use. Here's the verb use in the conjunct, and here's the verb use in the imperative. You can see these two don't have that prefix. So it appears only in the independent order. Just to give you an idea, here's how they are inflected, showing the same verb, hit. You can see only the independent order has this prefix, and then it's got a bunch of suffixes. The conjunct and the imperative only use suffixes. Okay, so most inflection is suffixes. Now, as I said, if there's no preverb, it goes on the verb stem. So here it goes directly on hit. If there's more than one, or sorry, if there's a preverb or more than one preverb, then it goes on the first preverb. So this nice sentence has two examples of verbs. One has one preverb and the other one has three preverbs. And in this one, this prefix goes on the first preverb. It's the only preverb. Here it goes all the way at the left in front of all three preverbs. So it moves over onto the leftmost preverb. And preverbs are things like try, and then this adds a manner component. There's an ability modal, and then some manner adverbial type things like meaning good and well and so on like that. Okay, now as I mentioned before, the preverb can be separated from the verb. So this is that same example, they will try to kill you. This future thing here is a second position clitic. Passamaquoddy Malice has a bunch of these. They have to go in second position. They always follow the first prosodic word in the clause that they're associated with. So that's telling us that this is a prosodic word separate from this. So the preverb is not forming a prosodic word with the verb after it. And other things besides clitics can separate them. So here's a freestanding pronoun. This pronoun, unlike those clitics, can stand on its own. If you ask me a question, I can just answer with nil, meaning me. I will do. So this can come in between the preverb and the verb too, and the prefix goes on that thing to the left. Okay, so it's not going with the verb necessarily. Well, sometimes it does, but if there's a preverb, then it goes on something else. Okay, so Halley and Marantz, 1993, in their paper introducing their theory of distributed morphology, gave an analysis of Potawatomi, which is an Algonquian language. And they claimed that this person prefix is a pronominal clitic. So what that means is it's not an agreement affix, it's a pronoun, like me, you, they, them. But what it means to be a clitic is to be prosodically deficient. So it has to glom onto something else and become a prosodic word with that. So English has some examples like reduced pronouns like get 'em, where it forms, it's not them anymore, you reduce it to and it sort of just gloms on to the verb that it's next to. Or gimme, which people write as one word, I think in recognition that it's forming one prosodic word. Okay, so their claim is that Potawatomi, this Potawatomi prefix is basically that, it's a pronoun, but it's prosodically deficient, it has to attach to something. And so what they say is that it appears at the front of the clause and just attaches to whatever's at the front of the clause. Okay, and this has been followed for other languages by a whole bunch of people saying that all the Algonquian languages have this pronominal clitic that's high up in the left edge of the clause. Okay, so I'm going to argue that that's not correct. It's actually an agreement affix. So then its distribution is problematic. So Halley and Marantz's only piece of evidence that it is a pronominal clitic and not an affix was that it can be separated from the verb, which we've already seen in Passamaquoddy Malice. It can go on a preverb, which can be separated from a verb. They claim it goes on this heterogeneous set of elements that can be anything, but the only examples they give are preverbs. So there's one that indicates assent in Potawatomi, and they thought this was just some kind of metalinguistic insertion thing. And so then this isn't attaching to anything verbal, but actually all of these things look to be the class of preverbs in Potawatomi. So that was their only piece of evidence for their claim. Now, as I said, their analysis was that this pronoun gets up to the front of the clause and then just attaches to whatever is first. So that would predict that it should always be at the left edge of the clause, which is just not true at all in Passamaquoddy Malice. In fact, verb, it only ever goes on a verb or a preverb, and those don't ever have to be anywhere close to the left edge of the clause. So there are a number of things that are obligatorily preverbal in Passamaquoddy Malice, like this negation, and this modal particle would. have to occur before the verb. But the prefix doesn't go on any of those things. It goes wherever the verb is. So all the way to the right. Passamaquoddy also uses question words like who, what, when, where as indefinites to mean someone, something, somewhere, and so on. If you don't front them, then they're indefinites. If you front them, then they're a question. When they're used as indefinites, they're almost always right before the verb. So those are semi-obligatorily preverbal, but the prefix doesn't go on that either. So it goes over there to the right. So the prefix is not occurring all the way to the left edge. And these things that are obligatorily preverbal, like negation and the modal, aren't always first either. You can have other things out to the left, but the prefix skips all those things. Here it's skipping another adverb and a demonstrative pronoun. Demonstrative pronouns also like to go right before the verb, along with those WH words. But the prefix just skips all of those and goes on the first preverb. So it actually looks like the verb and the preverb are not getting anywhere close to the front of the clause, but still the preverb or the prefix is going on them. Passamaquoddy also has a bunch of particles that they should look very familiar from English. They mean things like however, which typically come first in a clause. So that it does in English, basically. So this comes first, and yet you skip it for the location of the prefix. Okay, so the prefix does not come anywhere close to first. There are others too, like this one that means then, which is obligatorily preverbal. And this is that future clitic again, that's always second in its clause. Okay, so this is telling us that the front of the clause is right here. This is the first thing in the clause. So in Halley-Marantz's theory, the prefix should go on that, but it doesn't. It skips everything and goes all the way over here on the verb. Okay, just another one, because like English comes first, but you don't put the prefix on it. Now, as I mentioned, Passamaquoddy is a WH movement language. To get a question interpretation, you have to front the WH words like where, when, why, how. You have to front them to the front of the clause. But again, the prefix doesn't go on those. It goes all the way over here where the verb is. What Halley-Marantz said about this prefix just doesn't seem to be right. It does not go up high in the clause and attach to the first thing. And their evidence for it not being an agreement affix was not quite right. So let's look at evidence, what other evidence there might be to decide what sort of thing this is. So people have proposed ways to tell clitics from affixes. So Zwicky and Pullum 1983 were the first, as far as I know. They proposed 6 diagnostics. Now these ones are not that great. They mostly describe tendencies. I'll go through them anyway. There are more recent diagnostics I think are much better diagnostics. Okay, so their first one is selectivity. So clitics, they claim, exhibit a low degree of selection, whereas affixes are very selective. And we already saw that the Algonquian prefix is very selective. It attaches either to the verb stem itself or to a preverb. It doesn't go on anything else. Whereas Passamaquoddy second position clitics are not selective. They'll come after whatever is first in the clause. They don't care what that is. Okay, this again is only a tendency. Some clitics can be selective, like Romance object clitics, which typically precede only verbs. So this is not a particularly good diagnostic. Zwicky and Pullum's second diagnostic is that arbitrary gaps are more characteristic of affixes than clitics, where some combination that should occur just doesn't. It doesn't exist. There is no such arbitrary gap in Algonquian that I know of. So it's not acting like an affix in this regard. The third diagnostic is there are morphophonological idiosyncrasies. If there are, you're more likely to be dealing with an affix than a clitic. There is a morphophonological idiosyncrasy in Algonquian languages. So in all the languages, there's one allomorph before consonants. It's an N, a K, or a W, and then you add a T before vowels. So these are the reflexes in Passamaquoddy. So it's NT, KT, or historically WT before vowels. But then what's idiosyncratic is there are a few vowel initial stems that idiosyncratically use the one for consonants. Okay, so this is a morphophonological idiosyncrasy, which makes it more like an affix than a clitic. Zwicky and Pullum's fourth diagnostic is semantic idiosyncrasies, which they say are more characteristic of affixes than clitics. Again, this is only a tendency. In Algonquian, there are no semantic idiosyncrasies. This is a very regular affix marking the person of one of the arguments. Their fifth and sixth diagnostic, I think, are better diagnostics. So I'll highlight these maybe. Okay, so one of them is that affixes can undergo syntactic rules along with their hosts, but clitics can't. So I'll show you an example from English a little later. So we could think of the separation of the preverb from the main verb in Algonquian languages as some sort of syntactic rule is moving the preverb away from the main verb. And people have proposed that. So Dahlstrom and Brannigan both proposed that. So if that's what's happening, the preverb is moving away from the main verb across something like this pronoun, it's taking the prefix with it. So if it's doing that, then it's more like an affix than a clitic. Here's another example where two preverbs move across the subject pronoun, taking the prefix with it. And then their sixth diagnostic is that clitics can attach to other clitics, but affixes can't. Affixes has to come inside clitics. And in Passamaquoddy Maliseet, the prefix can never attach to a clitic. Again, it only ever goes on a preverb or a main verb. So here the clitic attaches to the preverb, and you can't ever get the prefix attaching to the clitic. So they never attach to clitics. Okay, so here's a pessimistic summary of their diagnostics, Zucchi and Pullum's diagnostics, where I put clitic if it didn't clearly pattern with an affix. And you can see in 4 cases of 6, it patterned with an affix. But the less pessimistic view is there was just no positive evidence that it was an affix in these cases. And also, as I said, these first 4 are mostly tendencies. I think the last 2 are the stronger of the 6 diagnostics, and they indicate that it's an affix. So let me go to the more recent ones. These come from Kramer 2014 and Preminger 2014. And they're specifically looking at agreement versus pronominal clitics, which is what we're talking about right now, whether this is a pronominal clitic or an agreement affix. So if we go look at their diagnostics, all of them that are applicable indicate that this prefix in Algonquian languages is an affix. Okay, so the first one is whether it's obligatory or not. So clitics generally don't have to appear if there is a freestanding argument in the same grammatical role, whereas affixes do, agreement affixes do. So this is the Passamaquoddy one is obligatory, regardless of whether you have a pronounced noun phrase filling that argument. So here, even when you pronounce I, you still need the prefix on the verb. Okay, so that makes it look like an affix. It's obligatory. Whereas in Romance languages, say like Spanish or French, you either can't or don't need to have the object clitic if there's an NP in the object role. Okay, their second diagnostic is whether you can index more than one argument. So in Romance languages, you can have multiple object clitics. But agreement affixes, you can typically only have one. So in Passamaquoddy Maliseet, we can actually set this up quite nicely because the prefix can sometimes indicate the object. So it can indicate either the subject or the object, depending on the context. It can indicate both first and second person. And so if you have both first and second person as the subject and the object, if you could have more than one, you should have more than one, but you can't. So here it's indicating the subject, first person I. Here it's indicating the object, they hit me. Here you can see you can have both second and first person, you hit me. But now you just get the K, you don't get both the K and the N at the same time. And you can't. You can't have both of them. The third diagnostic refers to ditransitives with 2 objects. So things like give me that. If you're dealing with a clitic, those behave independently in ditransitives. So you can have one for each object or either one without the other one. But if you're dealing with agreement, then what's typical is that you can only agree with the higher of the 2 objects. And that's what happens in Passamaquoddy Maliseet. So this prefix can indicate an internal argument in a construction that's called the inverse. It's marked by this little morpheme right here, this thing. When you do that with a ditransitive, the prefix can only mark the higher one, which in the English translation is the object of this preposition, the benefactive. So something like he or she makes it for them. The them is the benefactive. It's the higher of the 2 objects, which you can see by various tests, and it's the one that gets marked by this prefix, and you can't mark the other one. Okay, the fourth diagnostic is whether you get semantic effects. So clitics can sometimes mark only certain types of arguments, so specific indefinites or definites or pronouns, and they may have semantic effects for instance, in inducing a specific reading or an emphatic reading, versus agreement affixes, which don't have any of these effects. You just get an agreement affix. So in Algonquian languages, the prefix has no semantic effects. It indexes all arguments. We already saw it's obligatory. I gave you an example where it doubles a pronoun, so a definite argument. Here, the prefix is indicating this WH word being used as an indefinite. And these are very weak indefinites. They take lowest scope always. So if you have negation and this indefinite, it has to take scope below negation. So this has to mean there is no one. There does not exist anyone with this property. It can't mean someone is such that they didn't do this. Okay, so it can't take scope over negation. So these are weak indefinites. We already saw it with a pronoun. So this prefix marks every semantic type of argument. The fifth diagnostic is whether it agrees in all features or not. So affixes may agree in just a subset of features, but clitics tend to index all features. I believe this is because they're generally pronouns, and pronouns generally make all featural distinctions. So in Algonquian languages, you may have noticed this already, that this is indexing only the person. This is you plural hit me, but you just get an invariant K for you plural and you singular. If you want to indicate plural, you have to add this other suffix out here. Okay, so this is indicating only person, only first, second, and third person. If you want to indicate plural versus singular, you do that with these suffixes. Okay, versus the freestanding pronouns in the language, which index all features. So here are the second person pronouns. Gil is singular, Gilun is me and you, and Giluau is you plural excluding me. So the pronouns make all possible featural distinctions. Okay, the sixth diagnostic is that clitics tend to appear in all clause types, including especially non-finite clauses and imperative clauses. But affixes may disappear depending on the clause type. So we already saw that this prefix is limited to the independent order. It doesn't appear in the conjunct, and most tellingly the imperative. So it disappears in the imperative. Okay, so that makes it more like an affix than a clitic. The seventh diagnostic, I don't think is applicable, at least I can't find any way to test it. So this comes from Preminger, who says if you can find a way to break the agreement relation, what happens with a clitic is that the clitic just disappears, versus an agreement affix, you get a default realization, like typically third person singular or something. I can't find any situation where you can break an agreement relation in Algonquian, so I just can't test this. The eighth diagnostic is also not applicable. So the claim is that clitics can change binding relationships, and in particular, they can get around weak crossover and enable new quantifiers to bind new things that they couldn't have before. But the only way this will work is if the thing that you're testing, clitic versus affix, is not obligatory, because that's the only way to tell if it affected the binding relationship is when you had it or you didn't have it. And since the prefix is obligatory in Algonquian, we just can't test that as far as I can see. The other one isn't really applicable either. So this is specifically for object agreement versus object clitics. The clitics can still appear if you turn it into a passive or a reflexive form, basically by detransitivization. Object agreement will disappear. Now in Algonquian languages, the prefix typically is a subject agreement, so this isn't really going to work. And it also appears in intransitives marking the subject. So if you do turn a verb into a passive or a reflexive, that's detransitivization. It's an intransitive now. You'll just get the usual pattern, which is it's marking the subject. But I don't think that is telling us that it's a clitic. I mean, that's just how the agreement works. You mark the subject in an intransitive. The 10th diagnostic is that is added by this other paper by Baker and Kramer. The claim is that affixes can mark singular universal quantifiers and NPs that contain a bound variable, so non-referential things, but doubled clitics can't. And that's basically because they're pronouns. So if we look at Passamaquoddy-Maliseet, you can see this prefix is marking a universal quantifier each. The one on the noun over here too is doing that too. This is also clearly marking each person. And here's an example of a noun phrase containing a bound variable bound by this negated existential. Okay, so the prefix can index anything, including non-referential quantifiers. in Baker and Kramer included WH phrases in that as well, but because of the way the agreement works, prefixes typically don't appear in WH questions marking the subject or questioning the subject or object. So we can't look at those. Okay, so here's a summary of the Kramer and Preminger and Baker and Kramer diagnostics. You can see, except for these three that were not applicable, they all indicate that it's an affix. Okay, not a single diagnostic indicates that it's a clitic. Okay, so I conclude from that the prefix in Algonquian languages is a canonical agreement affix, which is exactly how most work on Algonquian languages since at least Bloomfield 1946 has treated it. It recognizes it's a canonical prefix, other than the literature that followed Halley and Marantz. Okay, so this is a prefix. It's not a pronominal clitic. Okay, but then we had a problem. So the pronominal clitic analysis had an advantage, which was it explains why the prefix appears where it does and why it's different from the suffixes. Okay, so it's different from the suffixes because they're not pronominal clitics. The prefix is a pronominal clitic, so they have different distributions, of course. So if it's not correct that the person prefix is a pronominal clitic, then we need a different way of accounting for the different distributions. Now, Bloomfield 1962 proposed a way. He said they're not actually different. Preverbs and verbs form compound verbs. And then the prefix and the suffixes are all attaching to the same thing and in the same way, just on different sides of this compound verb. Now, we already saw a problem with that, which is that preverbs can be separated from the verb. Like we could propose something like excorporation, which is what Brannigan in 2012 proposed. But I don't see any way that can work because the whole claim of this theory is that the preverb and the verb form a constituent, and then we're attaching suffixes and prefixes. So the structure has to be either one of these two or one where the prefix comes in between some of those suffixes. So the preverb and the prefix don't form a constituent separate from the verb and the suffixes on any possible compound analysis. So there's really no way one could make this compound analysis work. There are also some other suggestive data, like this really interesting sentence from a text. So he thinks about how he can torment them and be kind to them. So we have two preverbs. This WH phrase translated as how is questioning this manner added by this preverb. And then we have this ability modal. And the how and able is taking scope over both make them suffer and pacify them. He's wondering how he can do both of those things. So we can coordinate the verbs, the two verbs, below these two preverbs. Okay, so if we had an excorporation analysis, we'd need to be moving these two preverbs plus the prefix in an across-the-board fashion out of these coordinated verb phrases, which would be very complicated to do. I'm not sure how to do it. Versus if the preverbs never form any sort of constituent with the main verbs, it's straightforward. You just coordinate verbs below the preverbs. Okay, so I think data like this are indicating that the preverbs and the preverbs and the main verbs don't ever form any sort of unit. They very often are adjacent, like even in this example, they're adjacent, but they aren't forming some sort of syntactic unit. I should also mention that the authors of these texts put spaces here. That's often what they do, not always, but they often put spaces there. So I think they're recognizing that these are forming distinct prosodic words. Okay, so we need a new approach. The pronominal clitic analysis is incorrect. Having a compound analysis with excorporation won't work. Okay, so what are we going to do? I'll make a proposal that it's something I'll call a head adjunct. So the distribution, as we saw, is that the prefix goes on the first preverb or verb. I'm going to suggest that there are other things in other languages that have that same sort of distribution. So one of them is English affixal negation. Okay, so written as N''T, and is usually written with the thing it's attaching to. Okay. So it seems to move around. It goes on the first auxiliary verb in the clause. So here it goes on the progressive be. Now we add another auxiliary have before progressive be, and it now switches to have. We had a modal before that have, and it now switches to that modal. Okay, so it goes on the first auxiliary verb in the clause, which sounds a little similar to the Passamaquoddy prefix. Now you could say, well, this is just contraction. Negation always goes after the first auxiliary in the clause, so it's just leaning to its left. Okay, but it's actually not doing. That's not what's going on. There are processes of construction. So auxiliary construction does act that way. You put the auxiliary wherever it's going to go, and then it just leans onto its left. So here's some example. These things have been put away. The auxiliary have is just leaning onto the subject. It can lean onto other things. These things should have been put away by now. So have normally goes between should and be. And so it just leans on should, because should's what's next to it. If the auxiliary gets fronted in a question, it'll just lean on whatever to its left. So here's an object WH phrase. What's she doing? Here's an adjunct. How is she doing that? Okay, so this is just leaning onto whatever is to its left. And if what was to its left moves away, then it will contract onto whatever is now to its left. So I have this sentence, these things have been put away, where it's leaning onto the subject. The subject now moves away in a relative clause. What's now to its left is the complementizer, so it just leans onto the complementizer. The things that have already been put away. Okay, so auxiliary contraction acts like it's just leaning on whatever is to its left. Affixal negation does not do that. Okay, so here's a perfectly fine place for not after the adverb probably. These things have probably not been put away, but you can't just lean on to probably. These things have probably been put away. That's totally ungrammatical in English. You have to reorder so that it goes on have. So it can only go on an auxiliary verb. And if what was to its left moves away, affixal negation has to go with it. So here's, you shouldn't have given me that. If we now want to move should has to go along with should. Shouldn't you have given me that? And you can't move should and now have go on to the subject. Should you wouldn't have given me that. Okay, so is not acting like auxiliary contraction. It's very different. It can only go on an auxiliary verb. There's also an arbitrary gap. Remember Zwicky and Pullum's diagnostics. So their paper was actually about English I think it's even in the title, English there is an arbitrary gap. Most speakers of English don't have an emment. So if you want to use that, you have to use aren't instead. So aren't I silly? That kind of thing. There's a morphophonological idiosyncrasy. There's won't rather than willn't. It should be willn't, but it's not. It's won't. So Zwicky and Pullum, their whole paper is about how you can tell something like contraction with auxiliaries from an affix, which they claim int is. Int is an affix. And I think they're right. It does have all the properties of an affix, and it always goes on the first auxiliary in the clause. Okay, so let's try to analyze what's going on. Okay, so it's attaching to an auxiliary verb, and it's coming outside of the inflection, which I'll just call agar. I could call it infl or something else. It doesn't really matter. Now, the auxiliary verb still has the distribution of an auxiliary verb. We just saw this, so it goes where it would normally go, here between the subject and the next auxiliary verb, and before the subject in a subject auxiliary inversion case. So it still has the distribution of an auxiliary verb. So the structure as a whole must be an auxiliary verb. So the auxiliary verb has to be the head. So int is attaching to this thing. Now it doesn't seem to be required by have, because it's sometimes on have and sometimes not on have, depending on whether have is first or not. And in that sense, it's acting differently from that inflection. If you look at English clauses, every single verb in the clause, auxiliary verb and main verb, has to have exactly one inflectional suffix on it. They're sometimes null, which obscures it a little bit, but if you look across all English cases, every verb has an agreement or inflectional affix on it. Exactly one, not more than one, exactly one. So here's one on have. If we have two verbs, the other verb has one too. Modals can have them too. This one's null, this one has another one. So here's multiple cases. Is has one, having has one. Okay, so it looks like auxiliary verbs and main verbs too are requiring an inflectional affix. So if we put this in terms that you might be familiar with from like verbs selecting objects and so on, then it kind of looks like the auxiliary verb is selecting this agreement affix. It's not selecting this negation. So that makes it more like an adjunct or a modifier. What else? The other thing that makes it more like a modifier is it's coming outside the selected thing, the thing that's required. So this makes it more like a modifier or an adjunct. So I'll just call it an adjunct. It's forming a complex head with these other heads. So it's a head. So I'll call them head adjuncts. So it's a head, it combines with a head to form a complex head, but it behaves like an adjunct, not like something selected by the head that it's attaching to. So I'll call this a head adjunct. Now Pollard and Sag in 1994, and then some of my earlier work proposed that, well, let me back up. So I just mentioned that adjuncts are not selected. So that's their defining property, is they're not selected by things like verbs or prepositions or whatever. Most people think they just don't participate in selectional relations, but Pollard and Sag in my earlier work has suggested that they do, but it goes in the other direction. They suggest that, sorry, they select the things that they attach to. So we can see restrictions like adjectives select nominal categories, adverbs select other categories. So these are categorical restrictions that ought to fall under something like selection. So it must, but since they aren't selected themselves, they must be the ones doing the selecting. And adverbs can even select particular categories. So some attach low to VPs while others attach higher, maybe to IP or CP. And there are even some that attach only to PPs, like right modification, which is kind of famous, like right down the street, right across the road. They only go with PPs, so they're quite selective. So what I want to suggest that English affixal negation is a head adjunct that selects auxiliary. That's the only thing it appears on. So it's very selective. It selects that thing. Okay, so why is it on the first auxiliary verb? Well, let me make some background assumptions. So let's say we're going to build a clause. We want to select a bunch of things that we're going to use to build the clause. So call that selection enumeration. Chomsky uses this term for the things you selected to build your clause with. Suppose we selected unt. It's sitting there in our enumeration. And now we want to put it somewhere. How do we decide where to put it? Well, basically, you insert things into the derivation when you can. So things are opportunistic. As soon as, in old terms, as soon as their structural description is met, the rule will apply. So do something when you can, as soon as you can. Okay, so if it's selecting an auxiliary verb, as soon as you put an auxiliary verb into the structure you're building, unt is going to say, okay, attach me to, and then you'll stick it in. Okay, now why is it on the first one? Well, if syntax is being built in the order that we pronounce it, so left to right in a visual depiction on a page, then we'll get that result. You're building the syntax from left to right. The first auxiliary verb in linear order is going to be the first one you insert into the structure. And then int is going to say, hey, I'm here, insert me too. And so you'll stick it onto that first one. Okay, now this goes against most work in syntax, which assumes you build things bottom up. I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think we want to unify the way we do syntax with the way we pronounce and comprehend sentences. And the way to do that is to do things in a left to right order. I think this has lots of advantages, but it's an ongoing project trying to figure out how exactly it will work. But the basic idea is this thing is saying, insert me when you can, namely when what I select has been inserted into the structure. And if we're building left to right, then it will always go on the first thing. So that's the basic idea. And there are a lot of details, which I'll kind of skip over. I'm happy to talk about them if you want. I do want to point out that there are other things too that have the same distribution. So the Bulgarian definite marker is fairly famous, or at least heavily discussed in the literature, because the literature on Bulgarian had the same debate. Is it an affix versus a clitic? And they've all concluded it is an affix. It's a suffix. It has all the properties of a suffix. And yet its distribution is almost exactly like that of the Algonquian prefix. It goes on the first thing of the appropriate type, this time in a noun phrase though. It goes on the first thing that can bear nominal inflection. So that's the head noun itself, demonstratives, numerals, adjectives. That might be it. So if there's only a head noun, it goes on the head noun. If there's an adjective, it goes on that. It's this ta thing. If there's a possessive and an adjective, it now shifts onto the possessive because that's first. If there's a numeral, it goes on the numeral. But it skips over things that don't bear nominal inflection. So if you have an adverb modifying the adjective, adverbs are always in an invariant form. They don't agree with the head noun. So the definite marker can't go on that. Instead, it skips over to the first thing that does bear nominal inflection. And in Bulgarian, we can also see, interestingly, that its position is not structural from things like coordination. So if you coordinate two adjectives, the cool and fresh evening, the definite marker is a suffix on the first adjective only. It doesn't go on the whole thing. It doesn't go on both of them. It only goes on the linearly first one. Okay, so this is just like English affixal negation and just like the Passamaquoddy prefix. It goes on the first thing of the appropriate type. Okay, so we could just say all the things that it can go on, namely the inflection-bearing items in the NP, they all have something in common. We could call it plus N. I think the literature sort of just gave it that name. These things are plus N, meaning they bear nominal inflection. So if that's what the definite marker selects, then it will attach to the first thing if we're building left to right. Amharic also has a definite marker that has a very similar distribution. This paper by Kramer describes it as going on the first phrase in the NP. But if you look at all the examples, it's actually going on a particular head noun, or sorry, a head of that phrase is the head final language, which agrees with the head noun, which is almost exactly the same as the Bulgarian that we just saw. So in this example, there's an adjective which takes a complement prepositional phrase. Prepositional phrases do not agree with the head noun. Only the adjective does, and so it's skipping over to the adjective. Similar with these adverbs, they don't agree with the head noun. Big does, so it gets the definite marker. So the Amharic case is almost exactly like the Bulgarian one, with some complications because it's a head final language. Okay, so back to Algonquian languages. The proposal is the prefix is an adjunct. It's a head adjunct. I'll just call it an agreement head, an agar head. It selects a preverb or a verb, which we can unite just by making up a feature that they have in common. So plus V, call it. And then it selects a plus V head. So then it will merge when it can, as soon as you stick in a plus V head into the structure. So that will correctly locate it on the first preverb or the verb stem if there is no preverb. And it really doesn't matter where we put these in. So if the preverb has moved away from the verb, that won't matter either. If you're building left to right, if it moves to the left, you'll just insert the preverb into its higher position, add the prefix to it, except we're building left to right, so you'll actually add the prefix first, then the preverb. And then you can lower it to where you think it starts from. That doesn't really matter that much. So here's an example which I went through in the slides, but I won't here. I'm happy to talk about it though. So back to the suffixes. So if they are not head adjuncts, they're something else, then we account for their distribution. Okay. Okay. So one way to account for them is just to say, in a sort of standard head movement type way, these are functional heads in the clause, and the verb stem here moves through them all, picks them up as it goes. That's one possible account. Again, however, the technical analysis doesn't matter that much, so long as they're not head adjuncts, they're something else. So here, their heads attaching through head movement. That's one way to account for them. So then that makes them very different from this one prefix, which is a head adjunct. It's the only head adjunct. So that puts the suffixes on the verb stem, whereas the prefix is a head adjunct. I should mention there is one other thing in Algonquian languages that has exactly the same distribution, well, almost exactly the same distribution, which is what's called initial change. It's an ablaut process. You change the first vowel. So here's an example. It occurs only in the conjunct. Algonquianists distinguish the unchanged conjunct where it doesn't happen from the changed conjunct where it does, where you apply the ablaut process. So what happens is you change the first vowel. This is just the verb stem. You do it with the verb stem. But here's another example from a text. We've applied initial change to the first vowel of that verb stem. But if there's a preverb instead, then you change the first vowel of the preverb. I should have given an example where it's unchanged, but it's pumi and not bemi. So this is the changed version. I have a better example here. Okay, so here, the thing to look at is this preverb, wulub, which also occurs here. These are from the same text, just 2 lines apart. This one has an additional preverb, and initial change affects that one. You can see that's not affected. But in the next couple of lines where you don't have any other preverbs, now this one gets changed. Okay, so it affects the first vowel of the first preverb. Okay, so this is just like the prefix, except it's taking place in the conjunct rather than the independent order. Okay, so we can give that a very similar analysis. Suppose there's some abstract head, which is also a head adjunct, and its phonological form is to trigger ablaut on the thing it attaches to. So then it will be located in the exact same way the prefix is. So it's some abstract prefix basically triggering ablaut. Okay, and if it's a head adjunct, then we get exactly the same result. Okay, so let me wrap up then. Okay, so this prefix's placement has always been problematic. It's not a pronominal clitic, it seems to be a canonical affix. Analyzing it as a head adjunct in a left to right syntax puts it in the correct place. So I think this is an argument to do syntax left to right. We see other things like this, like English affixal negation and the Bulgarian and Amharic definite markers, and then this initial change in Algonquian languages. Let me say a little bit about typological predictions we might make. Okay, so the idea was adjuncts or things in general merge when they can. So when, well, if we're doing things by selection, whenever the thing that they select appears, or whenever something selects them. So things merge when they can. That's the basic idea. As soon as the structural description for some rule is met, you apply it. So if we're building things left to right, that will always put them on the first possible host. Now, if you wanted to put them somewhere else, you'd need a much more complicated algorithm. Like suppose you wanted to put them last. That would be kind of hard to do because you wouldn't know how many things you have to wait for. You'd have to somehow know that you have no more of those things to put in. Maybe you could do that. It would be a much more complicated algorithm. Even more complicated would be second or second to last. And so if the only thing you can do is merge things when you can, so be opportunistic, then we predict that there will only ever be things like this that attach to the first possible host. And that seems to be correct. I've never seen anything that attaches to the last one or the second one or the second to last. They might say, what about second position clitics, which are always second? Well, yes, they're second, but that's because they're attaching to the thing that's first. So the way you describe their distribution is with respect to the first thing. Okay, so as far as I know, this is correct. I've never heard of anything that goes in some other position. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
You have time for questions. Would you like to take a question?
Sure, that's fine.
And there may be some on the.
Oh, right. I have to unhide. So how do you unhide those now that they're?
It must be the same more.
Well, it's gone now because he hit it.
No, maybe down to the bottom.
You'd think we'd all know how to use Zoom by now.
Anybody know how to open the?
Yeah, how to unhide those things?
Bring them back.
Yeah.
Yeah, bring them.
Escape, okay. Oh, yep, they're there. Is there anyone else on Zoom? If anyone on Zoom does have a question, please just speak up. I might not see you. There.
It was very interesting. I'm an experimental phonetician, so this is a subject that has been most interesting to me for a long time. And I just have a very broad and simple question. If we are doing syntax left to right fashion instead of the usual bottom up fashion, which phenomena will be hardest to account for using left to right instead of bottom up? But this particular one is evidence for left to right. So I'm just trying to get, so what kind of phenomena will be most challenging if we want to build left to right?
So we're asking which ones actually occur and will be difficult for this theory to account for, and not what would be difficult for a left to right syntax to do and therefore ought not to occur. You're asking the first question.
That's the first question, but we can
Okay.
answer the other two.
Okay. Yeah, good question. Most things don't really change that much when you switch to left to right. You basically just do things in reverse. I mean, the structure is whatever you think the structure is. And if you're just building things left to right, rather than bottom up, not a lot changes. So where things get challenging is where okay, so I think I said this before, this is a work in progress, so I got to work out all the details. Yeah, so let's see, where have I run into issues? Well, there are lots of issues, but I don't think any of them arise particularly because you're doing it left to right. I mean, you sort of have the opposite issues that you do if you're doing it bottom up. Things that are hard to account for in the bottom up system are generally easier in the other way, but then other things become hard. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have an answer off the top of my head. You might be wondering about left to right versus top down too. So top down and left to right are almost the same, but they differ if you think things can be high and on the right. So if you're doing things top down, something high and on the right will be merged first or early anyway, versus left to right, it'll be merged last. So those get a little trickier. Is how exactly do you merge those and why? So now you've got this whole structure built. So generally in left to right, if you're doing a head initial language like English, you're going down as you go. But then when you get to one of those things, so there isn't really a question about where you merge it. You merge it at the bottom of the tree. But with those things, now you've got this whole structure, and the question is, where do you merge it? You've got lots of options. So properly constraining that is a little bit tricky. Do you have ideas about what would be hard? Okay.
I was just curious about, since it's kind of different approach to the whole structure building. There must be something that is going to be challenging for this approach that is kind of.
Well, not if it's the right approach, right? Then everything will just fall into place. Right? That's the hope anyway. Of course, nothing ever works out. Yep.
Yeah, this was great. I have a comment in that question. Sorry. The comment is into part one is that I don't know if you know Alaska Tech work. She and Bob Frank have a top-down merge proposal recently, where they argue for similar things. And part of my new question is that I thought that you meant top-down when you were saying left to right. So now I actually don't fully know that I understand algorithmically what that means. So that I'm gonna move that to the question, but just in case you didn't know that kind of work. Chris Casey has a computational version.
Oh yeah, no, I do know that work.
My personal view is that I don't find arguments from, oh, this is because it's gonna bring the grammar process to the comprehension model. Arguments very convincing, because from a computational perspective that doesn't mean much. You can take you can take a context-free grammar that looks bottom up, top down, and parse it in a bottom up model. So I think these arguments that you're making are way more convincing. Just to say that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That said, now my double question is, one is I don't actually understand what left to right means, because in an algorithmic fashion, whether you're parsing top down or bottom up, or whether you're doing left right or right to left, are complementary things. So I don't fully understand what a left to right parsing strategy, which is grammar building strategy, means. So if you can illustrate that a bit more. And the other question was, you said that this makes predictions that you should always attach first, which makes sense from a computational perspective, but aren't like temporal adjuncts? Temporal adjuncts don't seem to follow that. You can put really whatever temporal projection you want, right? like I have really liked the cake. Oh, I really have liked the cake.
Yeah, so there's a whole host of issues that arise with adjuncts.
Right, but here, so then my question is, so are you proposing, so up to that point, it seemed to me that you were just proposing, these are adjuncts, it's just that a class of adjuncts that follow a non-lexicalist kind, which seems totally fair to me, except that if they have also, if they are only the only kind of adjuncts that have positional selectional properties, that makes me a bit more suspicious.
Well, they're not the only ones that have categorical selectional
Oh,
properties.
no, of course.
So in these particular cases that I'm talking about, that's their only selectional property. They only select a category feature.
No, it's not the, sorry, it's not the category match, it's the greediness of the selection.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to imply that all adjuncts will always attach in the first place that they can. I didn't mean to imply that, because that's obviously not true.
Right,
So they're,
that seems like a strong architectural. Like, so now on top of having adjuncts and having adjuncts that are selectional, you also have only some adjuncts respect these greediness principles for others. That seems to be
no, that's not, so I would still say they all are trying to attach in the first place that they can. There are just other constraints or other possibilities. So I do think it's true that all adjuncts select categories.
Oh, yeah.
So, right, but then that will often leave multiple places where they could go in a clause.
Right.
And then the question is, where are they gonna go? Are they always gonna go on the first thing? Because there are no other constraints. So what I'm talking about is if there are no other constraints, you'll expect them on the first thing. But there may be other constraints, so scope, semantic scope. Or if there are two things of the category that you want to modify, then it's kind of up to the speaker. Right? Am I modifying this or am I modifying this other thing? What semantically do I want to modify? Now,
Oh, meaning if you have multiple
things meeting that,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the product.
So there can definitely be other constraints. So the ones I'm talking about seem to have purely categorical constraints, and then that's where we see the first thing coming out. You'll just put them in wherever they can. Do you want to comment on this?
I think my comment section relates to the less grammatically and strongest. So first, I want to say that I really enjoyed, especially seeing just the diagnostics. That's really the diagnostics really worried, right? Because I think people can apply any semblance of things. But so I was thinking about if you have, say, an embedded DP that contains a non-finite TP, then having the contracted negation, I think is going to be ungrammatical, right?
In a non-finite clause? In a non-finite clause?
Yeah. So you have, say, the non-finite clause is inside a DP. That's an finite. That's an argument of a finite clause. But said that you don't necessarily use the categorical restrictions, but you can see the contracted negation requires a finite thing.
Yes, that is true too. Yes, I left that out, but yes, there's a restriction to that.
Yeah.
Now people have argued that non-finite to is an auxiliary verb, but you can't contract onto to, so tuent. There are a couple ways.
To be not running.
That's ungrammatical for me, so there's no be in either.
Okay,
So there are a couple of things you can say. So it can never contract onto a non-finite form, or you could also view tuent as another arbitrary graph that just like emment. I'm not sure what the right.
To haven't read.
Yeah, you can say to have not read, but that might be constituent negation.
To have not read, yeah.
Yeah,
But you certainly can, to haven't read.
to haven't read, yeah, if you're not, right. Yeah, so it's limited to finite clauses, right? So, yeah, there are other restrictions on it as well, right? But I think you mentioned adjuncts attaching on the right. So that kind of relates to the previous question. Yeah, that gets problematic. So if you attach when you can, you might expect all adjuncts to be on the left unless they're a suffix or something. So again, there have to be other constraints. In some other work I was doing where I was trying to spell out how you would insert things in a left to right way, I ended up just stipulating that they attach on the right, which is obviously unsatisfying.
I find that okay. Yes, it's more that the thing that I find a bit unsatisfying, but not because you have to answer it now, is that one seemed to be a principle of the structure building operations, this greediness. But once you start saying, well, that has to interact with other constraints, that I find a bit unsatisfying.
Well, those constraints are also constraints on structure building. So we want to, so those a set of constraints that are applying it as we're building structure.
But you cannot, but can you give me an example of one that would prevent adjuncts to attach as soon as possible? Like, I don't understand about that. And again, you don't have to fix all your architecture right now. It's just because that's the argument that I find convincing is also the argument. Yes.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that too. What would stop it? Well, I mean, some obvious ones might be scope. Or
But
other
I don't understand
possibilities.
that. How is scope a constraint on when you do that touch? Scope is about planning the.
Well, you might, okay, so if you have an intended message, and you have, let's say, quantificational adverbs, which can interact with other quantificational things.
Oh,
So
sure, but
if you want an adverb to take scope below negation, say, even though it could potentially attach above negation, you might wait until after you've built negation. Maybe, I'm just making this up right now.
I understand. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, that's all.
Actually, can I go back to your question? I did think of something that at least I found very hard so far, which is head final languages. So yeah, that's something that I need to try to figure out. So I started trying to spell out that Amharic case and it got really difficult really quickly.
It doesn't at all matter to my, I mean, I didn't ask it because of it, but I happen to speak quite a lot.
And so what are you doing?
Don't see any hands up there. I have one, so I'm waiting. So part of the issue, I mean, this isn't Bolognese, it turns out, but there's strange things that are similar. But in particular, like in the English case, it's the int selecting the first auxiliary. And then the two of them are becoming part of a larger structure. So it is like external pair merge in a way. Is that right? I'm sure that's strong reflection. Is that like external pair merge? Because in the Passamaquoddy model seat, on the other hand, what we have is the head adjunct going with the first preverb or the first potential host, but it's before it. So it's the same question as like the others are suffixes. Is that just a listed thing? I'm a prefix, I'm a suffix.
That was the way I was modeling it because I don't have a better idea. And some of the things that I'm talking about are suffixes like int, and the Passamaquoddy model seat ones are prefixes, and I can't see any reason why that would be the case. I don't know. So
Okay, so then, can I make a suggestion?
sure.
What if this is about external pair merge in order of combining the rest of the
Okay.
Structure?
In what way? I mean, so I was conceiving it as, I mean, the process that puts these two together is the same as the process that puts those two things together. Except that this is selecting this and says, okay, you merge me, and then I select this, so I'll merge this in. And then you say, oh, is there something in waiting in the numeration that selects this thing? And you say, yes, this one. So then you merge them. But this has the same status as this. And the way you did it was the same operation. If you have another suggestion, I'd be happy to hear it.
Well, I need the two trees together to
Two being the
that
Passamaquoddy.
one in the past.
So that one gets a little trickier because it is a prefix. And so if you're doing things purely left to right, you have to merge the prefix first. So the way I was thinking of it was,
Which makes the prefix select the preverb.
yes, well, that's what I was saying it does. Exactly the way unt selects an auxiliary verb. So in the English case, as you're building, so the idea is you consider things in your numeration as you go. So the way you might start is to say, start with the phase head. So if we're building a CP, we'll start with C. But some things might come to the left of C. So we're gonna not yet merge C. We're gonna ask, okay, I'm considering C. Are there things that are gonna go in spec CP? And you can ask that in different ways, like maybe it's selected by C, or this has a WH feature or something like that. And so if it does, then you're gonna find that thing or build it. And only then will you merge in C. So it was the same idea with the prefix. So say we build a tree, these little dots mean there's some structure going on, I don't care what it is, and then we get to a point where we say, okay, I want to merge in a preverb now, but I don't do it yet, I'm considering the preverb. And now I can ask, are there any things that select this preverb as a prefix? And in this case, the answer is yes, so we would merge that first. In this case, it's a main verb, but it's the same idea. We merge the agreement first, so we merge the agreement, and then we merge the preverb in. So it has to go that as you consider something without actually merging it into the structure yet.
Yeah, so that is what I'm implying by external, that or built-in piece would
Okay.
do that without, would make these complexes external to the main line, larger structure built, the same way that you talked about the CP. So I think that would work.
So you would you'd have multiple workspaces and then put things together. Yeah. In the full paper of this, I actually have an argument that won't work. So, from the Bulgarian, yeah, that you'll run into trouble when you have multiple nested things.
Oh, yeah.
If you allow unconnected structures, then you can't constrain it properly.
That makes sense.
I mean, I maybe have a way of constraining it. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm only thinking about in the standard conceptions of the way that the structure is built, there is a relationship, say, between T and its complement or any of those going down. But then the complex that is built, its own separate construction, which is a complex head, then inherits and has satisfied its need for a complement of that kind, which would, when the complex thing is put in, it would then, the next thing to come in would be what it's selecting, P or BP. And so I was just relying on that to take care of all the problems without considering Bulgarian.
And you can never forget Bulgarian.
I always forget Bulgarian.
So I just had a quick question about the preverbs and the verbs. It said that there's like a plus and E feature that they have, as opposed to some of the auxiliaries, which can precede this affix that you've been talking about. So I was wondering if there is like more that you can say about this. Also, because some of the preverbs you had, it seems to me to be some of the life verbs, like in Germanic and Slavic.
Yeah, so
And
there
they
is.
also have similar distribution.
Yeah, so they are, let me find some good examples. So there is a literature that on Algonquian that let me find some good examples that points out that a lot of the preverbs are things that are auxiliary verbs in other languages. None here, but yeah, so try, well, I guess it's a restructuring verb in many languages. Many languages have it as an auxiliary. So you speak Korean, Japanese? Try is a auxiliary, well, it's, what do you call it in Korean studies? I don't know what it's called. Compound verb? But it's something like that. Okay. And then ability nodal is typically an auxiliary verb. But then there are these other things that add like manners and something that looks like a modifier meaning good, which are not typically auxiliary verbs, but they are preverbs in these languages. Yeah, so since I didn't have an idea of what the natural class of things here was, I just made up a feature plus V to make them be the same category as main verbs. Because there are a bunch of things that ought to fit in that category semantically, but are not preverbs. Like I showed you this modal ub, which means wood, and the future clitic udge ought to be one of these things, but it's not. So I don't know why, again, it looks kind of arbitrary.
More questions? Anything from the web? We are running low on battery, so.
My computer?
Here is, I think.
I can't even see it. I can plug it in, or are we done?
All right. Join me in thanking. Thanks to you all for being here. We're gonna lose power. All of you on Zoom, we're gonna lose power. So,
Oh, no, it's fine. It'll last for
you know,
minutes anyway.
all right, we are convened.